So what we're going to do now is we're going to add the next layer to this, this kind of unstructured kind of formative assessment. When we look at the logic of discipline, we are always thinking about, we see or hear a student making a mistake, whether it's when we're walking around the room and we're hearing conversation, or if we're bouncing in breakout rooms, if it's a Zoom classroom. We hear that, and our natural inclination, because our logic of discipline is to be like, okay, that's a mistake you're making, but this is the correction for it. Or to go back and reteach it, because that is the most expedient course of action. But I bring back up our example of that adorable little girl where she was convinced it was 1, 2, 3, 5. And the dad, who's a teacher, was trying to tell her over and over and over again, no, that's not how it is. And it wasn't until her mom had presented it differently that it clicked. So if we follow the logic of the learner as our guiding kind of point, we are able to go down a slightly different trajectory. Instead of thinking about the logic of discipline and its finite perspective, we're able to see and hear students' mistakes and misconceptions as we did before, but instead of saying, this is wrong and this is why, we instead ask probing questions that allow us to, as Stein said, examine boundaries of what the student does and does not understand. Because we're not going to be able to help the student to clarify their misunderstanding if we don't know the root of what their misunderstanding actually is. And so that's why these learning trajectories are so helpful. We can look at our standards, and we know our standards, and that is equally as supportive as the learning trajectories, but the trajectories provide us a quick way to see what did our student walk into the classroom with, to help triage the situation. And once we know what that root is of the mistake or the misconception, we can then help the student unpack it, and scaffold them into the knowledge that they should be interacting with on a grade level. So with our house that was leaning slightly to the left, we would then provide a way to make it a little bit more up and center. The next step in this process, we've looked at logic of discipline, we've looked at logic of learner. Now we want to think about, what are the look fors? What are we going to do next? As we're thinking about these modeling our world with mathematics resources, knowing that a teacher anywhere in the state could be using these resources with any years of teaching experience. It could be a teacher that's been teaching for 20 years, or a teacher that is new in this new school year. How would we help them to be able to essentially triage student learning, the mistakes students could be making, the misunderstandings and misconceptions they might have, and then provide that teacher who may be brand new to this a support to help formatively assess and help that student with those misconceptions. So I want you to think about, for the look fors in the student responses, what are those things that would clue a teacher in for the health module that we looked at? And then if you have decided what those look fors are, what is a probing question that you could pose to the student that would help you to understand their thinking a little bit more? Let's take like a couple minutes just to have this conversation as a group.
We talked about linear equations and the misconceptions there, of misunderstanding of the concept of slope and y-intercept, and interpretation of those things in context of a problem. And so, I mean, the common things you would see if you were just looking for, I mean, you could certainly ask contextual questions, and if people don't understand, when you ask, what does the point 0,7 being on this graph mean? And they can't explain that. That's one thing that that you might get some idea that either they don't understand y-intercept, or the misconception might go all the way back to a misunderstanding of the Euclidean plane and how to use it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, definitely. And that stuff is rooted in middle school. Anybody else?
We talked about the difference between, or the equivalence of percents and decimals and fractions, and the difficulties that students have there. And even just, you know, the like 0.7 is 7%, you know, they get that. So asking those kind of questions.
Excellent. Okay, so we have some look fors. We have some questions where we can ask like an open-ended question. Tell me more about where your answer is coming from, so that we can kind of get the student to expand on their reasoning and rationale, so we can help kind of figure out where they're coming from. the next step of this would be like to hear the student voice, to hear what the student is thinking, and then determine next steps of what would be. So using the last example that Christine said, where we get that fraction, decimal, percentage mess that often happens. If a student has it wrong and you have a conversation with the student and the student's like, what did you say it was, Christine? If the student says 0.7, they're saying it's 7%. Is that what you said? Okay, so what is something that what would be your next step as a teacher? Because ultimately, formative assessment doesn't have it's like a car that has no wheels if it doesn't result in next steps. So what would be the next step in that situation?
For me, I think I would just ask them about what does percent mean, so I know if they understand it, that it's out of 100, it's not out of, it's not just some point thing that shows up. So just digging into finding out what their understanding of percent is.
Awesome. And that's the great thing with formative assessment. As you ask more questions, you might figure out that the student's totally confused in something else. And it brings to light this larger issue. And that is, if we just stick with something fixed, like an entrance ticket or an exit ticket, we might not uncover all these misunderstandings without this conversation with the student. All right. So the whole issue is, this is all great. We know this. How in the world are we going to apply this? Because who knows what school is going to look like? So if we're looking at a synchronous environment, like I had you guys working in Google Slides, you were in groups, you were working together, I was bouncing between breakout rooms. You could do something similar. You can continue to use the functionality of G Suite, you can use Jamboard or Padlet, and I don't know if all of these are free. I'm sure some of them have fees. So you'll have to see what's available within your district, but you can continue to use collaborative workspaces as you may have utilized this last spring to go in that direction, and using Zoom to bounce between rooms. But if we have an asynchronous environment where kids are working at different times and you don't necessarily know when they're on, it might be advantageous to consider where in a Google Classroom you can turn off comments so that students can't say anything. This might be the year to let them say stuff and just hope that nobody says anything inappropriate on the classroom chat. Because the whole point of formative assessment is you're allowing the student opportunity to share their thoughts without the consequence of a grade. And if we get an assignment turned into us, and then we give it a grade and we pass it back, the learning is done for the student. They've received the grade, they're moving on. And so we want to be able to have that conversation with the kid, whether it's in a forum, whether it's an email or whatever, but make sure that we're providing a platform for that communication. So getting into feedback again, so in Norway, there was a study done in Norway where teachers said, I give great feedback to my kids. And the students are like, no, you don't. Nearly half of the students disagreed. So when you are giving written feedback, because maybe it's an asynchronous environment, or maybe you're passing papers back and forth because the student doesn't have internet, make sure that you're providing a way to ask those probing and targeted questions. Because even if the environment is different and we're not in the classroom, we still have to figure out where a student is coming from. What are the issues in the previous learning that we need to attend to? And so email is a really great place to do that if you can't use a forum. And for students who don't have access to internet technology, you might want to talk to your district in terms of what's available and accessible, but to have that conversation, scheduled check-ins or office hours might be a good course of action. And if you are going to continue to do Zoom meetings, making sure that students can phone in on those so they can still hear and contribute to the conversation. And I know that you guys know way more about what to do in this environment than I do, but these are the thoughts that I kind of have as we look at this. So your next steps, so from the conversation that we had today, you're essentially going to walk through independently kind of what we've talked about. What are the look-fors in a lesson that are based on the student logic from a learning trajectory connected with a modeling lesson? What would those probing questions be that would help you to understand the limit of student understanding and the next steps as a result of those probing questions? How would you differentiate instruction under the circumstances that we find ourselves in for those students?